Ethan Hale had sworn never to return to that cursed Wyoming homestead. But when the stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek carrying a woman with Eastern grace and a surveyor's confidence, everything he'd buried came clawing back to the surface. She claimed she was just passing through. The hand-drawn map tucked in her belongings told a different story, one that would drag them both into a battle for survival, justice, and something neither expected to find on the unforgiving plains. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind across Wyoming territory didn't whisper. It screamed. It tore through the high plains with the kind of violence that reminded a man he was small, temporary, and utterly alone. Ethan Hale had learned to love that wind. It drowned out memory. It buried the past under layers of dust and distance. He rode into Dry Creek just as the afternoon sun began its descent, painting the ramshackle buildings in shades of amber and rust. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Jasper, moved with the weary gait of an animal that had carried its rider too many miles with too few destinations. Ethan himself looked like what he was: a drifter, a cattle hand with no brand loyalty, a man whose only possessions were what he could carry in his saddlebags and the rifle strapped across his back. Dry Creek wasn't much: a trading post that doubled as a saloon, a livery stable that smelled of manure and hay, a handful of weathered structures that served no clear purpose except to prove that humans had been stubborn enough to build something here. The town existed because the stagecoach line needed a stop between Cheyenne and the mining camps further north. It survived on that necessity and nothing else. Ethan had no particular fondness for Dry Creek, but he had no fondness for anywhere. He'd spent the last 6 years moving, away from what he'd lost, away from what he'd failed to protect, away from the homestead that still haunted his sleep. Movement was survival. Standing still meant remembering, and remembering meant drowning. He tied Jasper to the hitching post outside the trading post and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit by oil lamps that cast more shadow than light. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, ammunition, rope, and the kind of practical supplies that kept frontier life from becoming frontier death. Behind the counter stood Coleman Briggs, the proprietor, a thick-necked man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. "Hail," Coleman grunted in greeting. "Thought you'd moved on." "Did," Ethan replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Come back." "Supplies?" "Coffee, beans, ammunition if you've got 4440. Coleman began gathering items, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd performed this transaction 1,000 times. "Stagecoach is due in about an hour. Might want to clear out before then. Gets crowded." Ethan nodded. He preferred empty spaces to crowded ones. People asked questions. People noticed things. People had a habit of getting tangled up in each other's lives, and he'd learned the hard way that tangles led to tragedies. He was examining a box of cartridges when the door swung open behind him. A young man entered, barely old enough to shave, with the eager energy of someone who hadn't yet learned that enthusiasm got you killed on the plains. "Mr. Briggs," the kid called out. "Stage is coming in early. They pushed hard from the last stop." Coleman frowned. "Why'd they do that?" "Don't know, but they're raising dust like hell's chasing them." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The instinct that came from years of reading trouble before it arrived. Stagecoaches didn't run early unless something was wrong. He paid for his supplies quickly, intent on leaving before whatever complications the stage brought could touch him. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. He was loading his saddlebags when the stagecoach thundered into town, wheels kicking up clouds of ochre dust that hung in the air like a warning. The driver hauled on the reins, bringing the horses to a stamping, snorting halt. The animals were lathered with sweat, their sides heaving. Whatever had motivated the early arrival hadn't been gentle. Ethan kept his head down, securing his supplies with practiced efficiency. Not his business. Not his problem. The stagecoach door opened. The first passenger to emerge was a traveling salesman, obvious from his worn suit and the sample case clutched in his hands like a shield. He looked shaken, his face pale beneath a layer of trail dust. He stumbled toward the trading post without a word. The second passenger was a woman. Ethan's hand stilled on the leather strap he'd been tightening. She stepped down from the stage with a grace that seemed entirely out of place in Dry Creek's hardscrabble reality. She wore a traveling dress in deep blue, practical but well made, with a fitted jacket that suggested Eastern tailoring. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a simple hat, though strands had escaped during the journey, framing a face that was striking not for conventional beauty, but for the intelligence and determination evident in every line. She carried herself with a composure that bordered on defiance, as if she knew exactly how out of place she looked and refused to apologize for it. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, and she moved with the kind of careful confidence that came from someone who'd learned to navigate spaces that didn't want her there. But it was what she carried that caught Ethan's attention. In addition to a modest travel bag, she held a leather satchel close to her body, the kind mapmakers and surveyors used. And as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, the satchel slipped slightly, its flap opening just enough to reveal papers inside. Maps. Hand-drawn, detailed maps. Ethan looked away quickly, cursing himself for noticing. Not his business. The driver was already unloading luggage, grumbling about the hard ride. "That's the last time I let passengers convince me to push the team," he muttered. "Lucky we didn't break an axle." The woman approached him with calm authority. "I'm grateful for your willingness to accommodate my request. The delay at the last stop would have cost me an entire day." Her voice was Eastern, educated, with rounded vowels that spoke of libraries and parlors rather than dust and danger. But there was steel underneath the refinement. This wasn't a woman accustomed to being dismissed. "You paid extra," the driver said, softening slightly. "But next time, miss, patience serves you better than speed out here." "I'll keep that in mind," she replied, but her tone suggested she wouldn't. Ethan mounted Jasper, ready to ride out. He'd gotten what he came for, time to move on, put distance between himself and— "Excuse me?" He stiffened. The voice was directed at him. He turned slowly to find the woman standing a few feet away, her dark eyes assessing him with the kind of directness that most frontier women learn to avoid. She didn't look afraid, though she should have been. A lone woman addressing a strange man in a lawless territory was asking for trouble. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice came out harder than intended. "I'm looking for someone who knows the land north of here. The stage driver mentioned you might be a drover who's worked these territories." Ethan's jaw tightened. He mentioned wrong. "My apologies." She didn't sound apologetic. "I'm looking to hire a guide, someone familiar with the— Not interested." He gathered his reins, ready to turn Jasper toward the road. "I can pay well." "Don't need money." "Everyone needs money, Mr. Not interested," he repeated, more forcefully this time. For a moment, she simply studied him, and Ethan had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like one of the maps in her satchel. Then she nodded once, accepting the rejection with more grace than he'd expected. "Thank you for your time." She turned away, moving toward the trading post. Ethan watched her go, feeling an unexpected prick of guilt. She was clearly out of her depth here. Women didn't travel alone in Wyoming territory unless they were desperate or foolish, and this one seemed too intelligent to be foolish. Not his problem, he reminded himself. He'd stopped solving other people's problems the day he'd failed to solve the one that mattered most. He rode out of Dry Creek heading north, telling himself he wouldn't think about the woman with the maps again. He made it 3 miles before his conscience, the part he'd thought he'd successfully buried, began to gnaw at him. The northern territories were harsh even by Wyoming standards. The grasslands stretched endlessly, broken only by occasional ravines and the skeletal remains of failed homesteads, monuments to ambition crushed beneath the weight of reality. Ethan had worked these lands for years, moving between ranches, never staying long enough to be remembered, never forming connections that might become chains. He made camp that evening in a box canyon that offered protection from the wind. As Jasper grazed on the sparse grass, Ethan built a small fire and began preparing coffee with the supplies he'd bought. The ritual was comforting, one of the few constants in a life defined by motion. But tonight, the familiar routine couldn't quiet his thoughts. The woman's face kept returning to him, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in her own way, but because of what he'd seen in her eyes. Purpose. Determination. The kind of focused intensity that reminded him of someone he'd once known, his father. Jacob Hale had been a man of iron will and impossible dreams. He'd dragged their family west from Missouri with promises of land and prosperity, determined to build something lasting in a place that killed dreams as readily as it killed people. Ethan's mother had died within 2 years. Fever took her in the winter of 1876. His younger sister, Sarah, had followed 3 years later, consumption hollowing her out until there was nothing left but coughs and apologies. His father had refused to leave, refused to admit defeat. Even as the land broke him piece by piece, Jacob Hale had clung to the belief that stubborn determination could overcome any obstacle. He'd been wrong. The memory of that final night rose unbidden, vivid despite Ethan's efforts to bury it. The sound of horses approaching in darkness, the shouts, his father standing on the porch with a rifle, defending what he'd built against men who wanted the water rights to their land. The gunshot that had ended everything. Ethan had been 19. He'd hidden in the barn like a coward while his father died in the dirt. By the time he'd emerged, the riders were gone, and Jacob Hale was bleeding out beneath a sky full of indifferent stars. The territorial marshal had come eventually, investigated, found nothing. The men who'd killed Jacob Hale had vanished like smoke, protected by whoever had hired them. The land had been seized for unpaid taxes, taxes that had mysteriously appeared in the territorial records after his father's death. Legal theft wearing the clothes of bureaucracy. Ethan had left the next day. He told himself he was going for help, for justice, but he'd known the truth. He was running from failure, running from the homestead that had devoured his family, running from the man he'd failed to become when it mattered most. He'd never gone back. The coffee boiled over, hissing as it hit the fire. Ethan jerked back to the present, cursing under his breath. He poured himself a cup and sat staring into the flames, trying to push the past back into its grave. But something about that woman, about the determination in her eyes, about the maps she carried, had cracked open the door he'd worked so hard to keep closed. He didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, Ethan told himself he was riding back to Dry Creek because he'd forgotten to buy tobacco. It was a lie transparent even to himself, but he needed the fiction to justify turning Jasper south. He reached the town by late morning. The stagecoach was gone, continuing its northern route. Several people moved about their business. Ranchers loading supplies, a group of miners sharing a bottle outside the saloon. Coleman Briggs was sweeping the steps of his trading post with the same rhythmic motion of a man performing penance. "Back already?" Coleman said as Ethan dismounted. "Forget something?" "Tobacco." Coleman's skeptical look suggested he wasn't buying it, but he went inside without comment. Ethan followed, scanning the interior as casually as possible. The woman wasn't there. "If you're looking for the lady from yesterday's stage," Coleman said without turning around, "she took a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house." Ethan felt heat climb his neck. "Wasn't looking for anyone." "Uh-huh." Coleman set a pouch of tobacco on the counter. "She's been asking questions, lots of questions about the Northern Territories, about land parcels and water rights, about—" He paused meaningfully. "Abandoned homesteads." Something cold slithered down Ethan's spine. "What homesteads?" "Didn't give specifics, but she's got maps, Ethan, detailed ones, been spreading them out at Henderson's, studying them like they're sacred texts." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. There were dozens of abandoned homesteads in the Northern Territories, hundreds even. No reason to think she was interested in any specific one. No reason to care if she was. "Not my concern," he said, paying for the tobacco he didn't want. He should have ridden out then, should have climbed back on Jasper and continued north, putting distance between himself and whatever the woman was planning. Instead, he found himself walking toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The building was the closest thing Dry Creek had to respectable lodging, a 2-story structure with actual glass windows and a porch that didn't sag. Mrs. Henderson herself was a widow who'd survived 3 husbands and seemed determined to outlast the territory itself. She answered Ethan's knock with raised eyebrows. "Ethan Hale. Haven't seen you darken my door in 2 years." "Ma'am," he touched his hat brim. "Looking for the woman who came in on yesterday's stage." "Miss Moore?" "She's in the dining room, working." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes assessed him. "You planning trouble?" "No, ma'am, just conversation." "See that it stays conversation." She stepped aside to let him enter. The boarding house interior smelled of lye soap and yesterday's beef stew. Ethan followed the sound of rustling paper to the dining room and stopped in the doorway. The woman, Miss Moore apparently, sat at the long table with maps spread across its entire surface. She'd removed her jacket, working in her shirt sleeves with her hair pinned up carelessly. A pencil was tucked behind one ear. She made notes in a leather-bound journal, cross-referencing between the maps and a sheaf of official-looking documents. The scene was so familiar it punched the air from Ethan's lungs. His father had worked exactly like this, obsessive, meticulous, certain that enough careful planning could overcome any obstacle. She looked up, sensing his presence. Surprise flickered across her face, followed quickly by guarded curiosity. Mr. She left the question hanging. Hale. Ethan Hale. The name felt like a confession. Miss Evelyn Moore. She set down her pencil, giving him her full attention. You've reconsidered about guiding? Maybe. Depends on where you're headed. North. Approximately 40 miles north-northwest of here. She pulled one of the maps toward her, pointing to a marked location. There's a... Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes locking onto the map. His blood turned to ice. The location she'd marked was unmistakable. The creek that ran southeast. The 2 distinctive rock formations. The exact positioning relative to the distant mountains. He'd know that land in his sleep, in his nightmares, in the fever dreams that still came on bad nights. It was his family's homestead. Where did you get this map? His voice came out harsh, accusatory. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I drew it, from territorial surveys and that land. He jabbed a finger at the marked location. How do you know about that land? Because I own it, Mr. Hale. Her voice remained calm but firm. I purchased it legally through the Territorial Land Office 6 months ago. The room tilted. Ethan gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. You own it. Yes. Is there a problem? A problem. The word was so inadequate it would have been funny if Ethan could remember how to laugh. That land had killed his family. That land was where his father's blood had soaked into the dirt. That land was every failure, every nightmare, every reason he'd spent 6 years running. And this woman owned it now. How? He managed. How did you buy it? Through proper channels. The property was seized for tax delinquency and it was stolen. The words ripped out of him. Taxes that appeared from nowhere after my father was murdered to defend that land. Evelyn went very still. Your father? Jacob Hale. Killed in 1879 by men who wanted our water rights. The territorial government looked the other way. And someone stole the land legally. Ethan's voice shook with barely contained fury. And now you show up with your maps and your Eastern manners, claiming you own what my family died for? For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I didn't know. The land office records listed it as abandoned, claimed by the territory after unpaid debts. There was no mention of... She stopped, studying his face. I'm sorry for what happened to your family, Mr. Hale, truly. But I purchased that land legally, and I intend to use it. For what? Bitterness colored every word. What could possibly be worth... Food. The single word cut through his anger like a knife. Evelyn stood, gathering several documents and spreading them before him. Look. Really look. Despite himself, Ethan looked. The papers were technical drawings, architectural plans for buildings, irrigation systems, crop rotation schedules. Notes filled the margins in precise handwriting discussing soil composition, water management, weather patterns. One document was titled Sustainable Agricultural Research, Northern Plains Initiative. I'm not a land speculator, Mr. Hale, Evelyn continued. I'm completing my father's work. He was an agricultural researcher, spent 20 years studying how to make the plains viable for sustainable farming. He believed that with proper technique, the right crops, the right water management, settlers could survive here without depleting the land. Her voice softened. He died 2 years ago, before he could test his theories. I'm finishing what he started. Ethan stared at the documents, emotions warring in his chest. Anger at seeing his father's land in a stranger's hands. Grief at the reminder of everything he'd lost. and something else, something he didn't want to name, as he recognized the same obsessive determination that had driven his father. "Why that land specifically?" he asked. "The geology, the water table, the position relative to weather patterns." She traced a line on the map. "That location has everything needed to make the research work. According to surveys, there's a natural spring system the springs near the western ridge." Ethan's throat tightened. "My father found them. Thought they'd be our salvation." Evelyn's expression shifted to something like compassion. Then he understood what that land could be, what it should be. "What it should be," Ethan repeated hollowly. "It's a grave. That's all it is. Or it could be what your father dreamed, what my father dreamed." She met his eyes directly. "I understand if you can't help me. I understand if the land carries too much pain, but I'm going there, Mr. Hale. With or without a guide. With or without your blessing. You'll die." The words came out flat, factual. "You have no idea what you're facing. The land alone will kill you before winter. And if word gets out that someone's trying to homestead that property again," he shook his head, "whoever killed my father to get that land, they're still out there. They'll kill you too." "Perhaps." Evelyn's jaw set in a stubborn line. "But I'm going anyway. I've spent 2 years preparing for this. I've liquidated everything I own. This is my father's legacy and my life's purpose." She paused. "However, I'm not foolish. I know I need help. Someone who knows the land, knows the dangers, someone who," she hesitated, "someone who has a reason to see that place become something other than a grave." Ethan wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to protect himself from the pain that going back would inevitably bring. That homestead was his worst nightmare made tangible, the physical manifestation of every failure that haunted him. But as he looked at Evelyn more, at the determination in her eyes, at the maps spread before her like battle plans, he saw his father's ghost. Jacob Hale had died believing something could grow in that harsh soil, had died defending that belief. And Ethan had run away. "I'll take you," he heard himself say. The words felt like surrender. "I'll guide you to the property, help you understand what you're facing, but I won't stay. Once you see the reality of what that land is, you'll understand why no one should try to build there." Evelyn's face lit with relief and something that might have been triumph. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. I promise you won't—" "Don't promise anything," he cut her off. "And understand this. I'm doing this so you'll see the truth and leave. That land is cursed. It destroys everything it touches. The sooner you learn that, the sooner you can go back east and find some other dream to chase." If his harsh words wounded her, she didn't show it. She simply extended her hand across the table. "We leave tomorrow?" Ethan stared at her offered hand for a long moment. Shaking it felt like sealing his own fate, like agreeing to walk back into the hell he'd escaped. But he'd already committed, already accepted that he was going to return to the place where everything had ended. He clasped her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused in a way that surprised him. These weren't the soft hands of someone who'd never worked. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Before dawn. Bring only what you can carry on horseback. The journey will take 3 days, maybe 4. "I'll be ready." Ethan nodded and turned to leave, needing to escape the dining room before the weight of what he'd agreed to crushed him. He was at the door when her voice stopped him. "Mr. Hale?" He looked back. "I am sorry about your family, about what happened to your father." Her voice carried genuine sympathy. "I know my presence on that land must feel like a violation, but perhaps we can both find something there. Perhaps both our father's dreams can survive." Ethan wanted to tell her she was wrong, wanted to explain that some places were too stained with blood to ever grow anything but pain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply touched his hat brim and left. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled its familiar song, the sound of isolation, of harsh truths, of a land that gave nothing freely. Ethan stood on the boarding house porch, breathing in the cold air, trying to prepare himself for what was coming. He was going home. After 6 years of running, he was finally going home. The thought terrified him more than anything he'd faced in all his years of drifting. But he'd given his word, and whatever else Ethan Hale had lost, family, home, faith, he still had that. His word was one of the few things that remained unbroken. He walked back to the livery stable where Jasper waited, his mind already cataloging what supplies they'd need for the journey. 3, maybe 4 days to reach the homestead. Then however long it took for Evelyn Moore to understand the brutal reality of what she'd purchased. A week, perhaps 2 at most, before she admitted defeat and returned to civilization. That's what he told himself. Deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Ethan suspected it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing about Evelyn Moore seemed simple. The same determination that had driven his father to his death, the same stubborn refusal to accept that some dreams were impossible, he'd seen that in her eyes. It both terrified and fascinated him. That night, Ethan made camp outside of town, unable to face the thought of sleeping in a bed. He lay on his bedroll, staring up at the vast Wyoming sky, at stars so numerous they seemed to bleed together into a river of light. His father had loved this sky, had called it proof that beauty existed even in harsh places, that light persevered even in darkness. Ethan had stopped believing in his father's poetry years ago, but tomorrow he would ride north. Tomorrow he would face the ghosts he'd been running from. Tomorrow, for the first time in 6 years, he would stand on the land where his father had died, believing in the impossible. And beside him would be a woman who believed in impossible things too. Whether that made her brave or foolish, Ethan couldn't say. Perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps every dream big enough to change things required a measure of foolishness, a willingness to risk everything on uncertain ground. His father had been willing. It had killed him. Now Evelyn Moore stood ready to make the same gamble, to stake her life on the same cursed earth. And Ethan? He'd already decided his role. He would be the voice of reason, the bitter reality check, the one who would show her the truth and then watch her leave. That's what he told himself as sleep finally claimed him beneath the indifferent stars. He would guide her there and watch her leave. He would remain unmoved, unchanged. He would survive this journey the same way he'd survived the last 6 years, by refusing to let anything matter enough to hurt him. These promises felt hollow even as he made them, but Ethan clung to them anyway. They were all he had. The woman with her maps and her father's dreams, she was just passing through. And so was he, always passing through, never staying long enough to be wounded again. The wind howled agreement, and Ethan let himself believe it, let himself pretend that going back wouldn't change everything. Tomorrow, the journey would begin. Tomorrow, he would face his past, and beside him would ride a woman who saw a possibility where he saw only graves, who looked at his family's failure and saw the foundations of her own impossible dream. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he wouldn't care. He told himself he could walk away again when the time came. The wind howled on, and Ethan closed his eyes against the stars, trying not to wonder if all those promises, to himself, to his father's ghost, to the cold comfort of solitude, were already starting to crack. Dawn broke cold and colorless over Dry Creek, the kind of morning that promised nothing and delivered less. Ethan was already awake, had been for hours, unable to find rest in the few hours he'd attempted sleep. He'd spent the darkness checking and rechecking his gear with the obsessive focus of a man preparing for battle. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A battle against memory, against the gravitational pull of a past he'd sworn to leave buried. Evelyn Moore appeared at the livery stable just as the first pale light touched the eastern horizon. She wore practical traveling clothes, split riding skirt, sturdy boots, a canvas jacket that had seen use. Her hair was braided and pinned close to her head beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She carried 2 bags, both considerably lighter than what she'd arrived with. "You came," she said, and Ethan heard the note of surprise in her voice. "Said I would." He gestured to the mare Coleman Briggs had agreed to rent her. "That's Sadie. She's steady, won't spook easy. You know how to ride." "Well enough." Evelyn approached the horse with confidence, running her hand along Sadie's neck in greeting. The mare accepted the attention calmly. "I'm not as experienced as someone who's spent years in the saddle, but I won't slow us down." "We'll see." Ethan's tone was deliberately gruff. He secured her bags to the saddle, noting their weight. "This everything?" "The essentials, my research notes, basic supplies, seeds." She caught his skeptical look. "I shipped the bulk of my materials ahead to Fort Kearney. They're being held there until I can arrange transport to the property." Of course she'd planned that far ahead. Ethan felt a grudging respect he didn't want to feel. Smart, assuming you actually make it that far. I will. No hesitation, no doubt, just flat certainty. They rode out as Dry Creek began to stir, leaving behind the last outpost of what passed for civilization in these territories. The land opened before them like a wound, vast, raw, beautiful in its brutality. The early morning light painted the grasslands in shades of gold and shadow, and the wind that never stopped carried the scent of sage and dust. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Ethan set a steady pace, not too fast, allowing the horses to warm into the work ahead. He kept his attention divided between the trail and his reluctant companion, watching for signs that she was struggling with the ride. But Evelyn sat her saddle with decent form, moving with Sadie's gait rather than fighting it. She'd understated her experience, he realized. This wasn't her first long ride. "You're quiet," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Is that temperament or strategy?" "Both." Ethan didn't look at her. "Out here, talking wastes water and attracts attention. Neither's advisable." "Attention from what?" "Raiders, claim jumpers, natives who've got every right to resent us crossing their land, predators, the four-legged kind, and otherwise." He gestured to the endless expanse around them. "The territory looks empty, but it's not. Things are always watching." Evelyn absorbed this without visible fear. "You've dealt with all of those?" "Most, survived by keeping my head down and moving on before trouble could find me." He finally glanced her way. "You should have hired someone else, someone who knows how to fight instead of run." "I don't think that's true." Her voice was thoughtful. "I think you know exactly how to fight. You just choose not to." The observation struck too close to something Ethan didn't want examined. "You don't know anything about me. I know your father died defending that land. I know you were there. I know you left and never went back." She urged Sadie closer, studying his profile. "That's not cowardice, Mr. Hale. That's survival instinct. There's a difference." "Is there?" The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "Tell that to my father's ghost. Your father made his choice. You made yours. Both took courage." Ethan wanted to argue, to explain that there was nothing courageous about hiding in a barn while your father bled out in the dirt. But the words wouldn't come, strangled by the shame that never quite left him. Instead, he urged Jasper forward, increasing their pace enough that conversation became difficult. They rode hard until midday, stopping only when Ethan found a creek where the horses could drink and graze. The water ran clear over smooth stones, cold enough to make his teeth ache when he cupped his hands for a drink. Evelyn knelt beside him, refilling her canteen with efficient movements. "Tell me about the land," she said. "The homestead. What was it like before my father died defending it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "It was hard. Everything was hard. My mother lasted 2 winters before the fever took her. My sister 3 more. The crops failed more often than they grew. The cattle got sick, froze, starved. We fought the land every day and lost more than we won. But you stayed. My father stayed. Wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't admit defeat. He believed." Ethan stopped, the memory sharp as broken glass. "He believed that determination was enough. That if you wanted something badly enough, worked hard enough, refused to give up, the land would eventually yield. And you think he was wrong?" I watched him die, proving it. Ethan stood abruptly, unable to continue the conversation. "We need to cover more ground before dark. Let's move." But Evelyn didn't move. She remained kneeling by the creek, her dark eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. What if he wasn't wrong? What if he just didn't have the right knowledge, the right techniques? What if the determination was there, but the science wasn't? "Science?" Ethan nearly laughed. "The land doesn't care about science, Miss Moore. It takes what it wants and gives nothing back." "You're wrong." She rose, facing him with that same stubborn conviction he'd seen in his father's eyes so many times. "The land gives everything, if you understand how to listen. My father spent 20 years learning its language, soil composition, water tables, native plant species, weather patterns. He developed methods that work with the land instead of against it. That's what I'm bringing to your homestead, not just hope, knowledge." My father had knowledge, had books, talked to every farmer and rancher for 100 miles. It didn't save him. Maybe not. But maybe it's not supposed to save anyone. Maybe it's supposed to build something that outlasts us. Something that makes the sacrifice mean something. Evelyn's voice softened. Don't you want that? Don't you want what happened to your family to matter for something more than grief? The question pierced him like a blade between the ribs. Because yes, of course he wanted that. Every day for 6 years he'd wanted that. But wanting and achieving were separated by an ocean of blood and failure, and Ethan had learned not to confuse the two. We're burning daylight, he said, instead of answering, mounting Jasper with more force than necessary. If you want to reach the first waypoint before dark, we need to move. This time, Evelyn didn't press. She simply mounted Sadie and followed, leaving the conversation unfinished between them like the creek they left behind, flowing, persistent, impossible to dam completely. The afternoon stretched long and hot. The landscape shifted gradually, the flat grasslands giving way to rolling hills that promised the mountains beyond. Ethan's body remembered this country even if his mind had tried to forget. Every rise and hollow, every landmark that told him they were drawing closer to the place he'd sworn never to see again. Around 3, Evelyn broke the silence with a different kind of question. The men who killed your father, were they ever found? No. Do you know who sent them? Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. Someone with money and connections. The kind who can make territorial records change, who can ensure marshals find nothing when they investigate. He'd spent months after his father's death trying to uncover the truth, following threads that led nowhere, running into walls of silence and official indifference. Water rights are worth killing for out here. Our property sits on one of the best spring systems in the territory. Whoever wanted it was willing to do whatever it took to get it. And now I own it. Evelyn's voice was thoughtful, not frightened. Which means I've painted a target on my back. Finally, you understand. I understood before I came, Mr. Hale. I'm not naive. She guided Sadie around a prairie dog mound with practiced ease. My father warned me. He knew powerful interests would resist what he was trying to do, prove that settlers could thrive without corporate support, without the ranching combines and railroad companies controlling every resource. Independent success threatens their business model. Ethan turned in his saddle to stare at her. You knew all this and came anyway? Of course, the work is worth the risk. The work. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. Your father's already dead. You want to join him? I want to finish what he started. There's a difference. Fire flashed in Evelyn's eyes. You think I don't understand sacrifice? You think I don't know what I'm risking? I spent 2 years watching my father die from a heart condition that the doctors said worry and overwork had caused. He died believing his life's work was incomplete, that everything he'd learned would die with him. I promised him I would see it through. So this is about a deathbed promise. Ethan's voice was harsh. That's not a good enough reason to get yourself killed. It's as good a reason as your father had for staying, for dying. Evelyn urged Sadie forward until she rode beside him, forcing him to meet her gaze. You're angry he didn't run, angry he didn't save himself. But would you have respected him if he had? Would you? The question hit like a physical blow, because no, Ethan wouldn't have. Even after everything, even after 6 years of running himself, he still held his father's stubbornness sacred. Jacob Hale had refused to be driven from land he'd claimed, refused to let bullies and murderers win. He'd died for that principle. And Ethan had run from it. Respect doesn't bring anyone back from the dead, he said finally. No, but it gives meaning to death. It makes sacrifice count for something. Evelyn's voice gentled. I'm not here to die, Mr. Hale. I'm here to live, to build, to prove that this land can sustain people without destroying them. If I fail, if I die trying, at least I'll have tried. They rode on in silence after that, the shadows lengthening as the sun tracked westward. Ethan found himself watching Evelyn when he thought she wouldn't notice, the set of her shoulders, the way she scanned the horizon constantly, learning the land even as they crossed it. She wasn't what he'd expected. Eastern women were supposed to be fragile, unsuited for the harsh realities of frontier life. But Evelyn Moore moved through this landscape with a kind of determined grace, absorbing its challenges without complaint. His father would have liked her, Ethan realized with a pang. Jacob Hale would have recognized a kindred spirit, someone stubborn enough to chase impossible dreams across impossible distances. By the time they made camp that evening, Ethan's emotions were a tangled mess of resentment, reluctant respect, and the growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake agreeing to this journey. Evelyn Moore was going to die on that land, and he was going to have to watch it happen. Another person destroyed by the same cursed ground that had taken his family. He selected a campsite in a shallow depression that offered protection from the wind and concealment from anyone watching the trail. While he tended the horses, Evelyn gathered dry buffalo chips for fuel. She'd seen him do it earlier and adapted without being told. She moved with the economical efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, who understood that survival required paying attention to details. "You're good at this," Ethan found himself saying as they built the small fire. "Most Eastern women would be useless out here." My father believed in practical education. We spent summers traveling through farming communities, talking to settlers, learning techniques. I've camped rough before. She arranged the fuel with skilled hands. Not like this, not in truly wild country, but I'm not completely unprepared. There's a difference between camping near civilization and surviving out here. I'm learning that. Evelyn accepted the jerky and hardtack he offered without complaint, though he knew the fare was barely edible. "Tell me more about the land, the homestead itself. What buildings were there? What state are they in now?" Ethan found himself talking despite his intention to remain silent. Maybe it was the firelight, or the intimacy of shared isolation, or simply the fact that he was already halfway back to his past and couldn't stop the memories from surfacing. He described the layout, the house his father had built, the barn that still haunted his nightmares, the well that tapped into the spring system, the fields that had produced just enough to keep hope alive and never quite enough to bring prosperity. "The buildings might still be standing," he said, staring into the flames, "or they might have burned, collapsed, been torn down for lumber. 6 years is a long time to leave something exposed to the elements. But the land is still there, the springs, the soil, the potential." Evelyn wrapped her blanket tighter against the cooling air. "That's what matters. Potential." The word tasted bitter. "That's what my father always talked about. The land's potential. Our potential. All that potential and nothing to show for it, but graves." "Not nothing." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "The work he did, clearing the land, testing the soil, finding the springs, that's knowledge. That's foundation. I'm not starting from nothing because of what your father built. He's not here to see it. No. But maybe that's why I need to succeed, for him, for my father, for everyone who's tried and failed." She met his eyes across the fire. "For you, Mr. Hale. Maybe most of all for you. Don't." The word came out sharper than intended. "Don't make me part of your mission. I'm here to guide you, nothing more. When you see what you're really facing, when the reality crushes your dreams like it crushed his, I'll watch you leave and feel nothing. Will you?" The question was gentle, knowing. "I don't think so. I think you'll care deeply, no matter how hard you try not to. That's why you're here. That's why you agreed to guide me, even though every instinct told you to refuse. Because some part of you wants to believe it's possible. Some part of you wants to see your father's dream succeed." Ethan wanted to deny it, to throw her words back with the contempt they deserved. But exhaustion and honesty stripped away his defenses, leaving him exposed and raw. "What I want doesn't matter. What anyone wants doesn't matter. The land takes what it wants, and we die trying to stop it. Or we learn to work with it instead of against it." Evelyn laid down, pulling her blanket up to her chin, her face barely visible in the firelight. "Tomorrow, when you're ready, I'd like you to tell me everything you remember about the growing seasons there, the weather patterns, when the spring floods came, when the drought hit, everything your father learned. Why? Because knowledge shouldn't die with the people who hold it. Your father paid in blood for what he learned about that land. The least I can do is honor that by learning from it." Ethan didn't respond. He lay awake long after Evelyn's breathing deepened into sleep, staring up at the stars that had witnessed his father's death and now watched him return to that place of ending. The night sounds of the plains, wind through grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the soft movements of the horses, formed a symphony he'd once known by heart. Coming back felt like betraying his carefully constructed exile. For 6 years, he'd survived by feeling nothing, by keeping everyone at arm's length, by refusing to let the past have any claim on his present. But now, guided by a woman who saw hope where he saw only horror, he was walking straight back into the fire that had consumed everything he'd loved. And the worst part, the thing that terrified him most, was that Evelyn Moore was making him want to believe again, making him remember that his father had died defending something precious, making him wonder if running had been less about survival and more about surrender. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm of riding and rest, conversation and silence. Ethan found himself talking more than he had in years, answering Evelyn's endless questions about the land, soil types, water sources, native plants, animal patterns. She absorbed everything with fierce concentration, making notes in her journal during rest stops, cross-referencing his observations with her father's research. "The spring floods," she said on the second afternoon as they picked their way through a rocky section of trail. "You said they came in April." Late April, early May, snow melt from the mountains. The creek would swell, sometimes flood the lower fields. "Did your father try to control it? Channel it?" "Tried. Built some earthworks, but they washed out more often than they held." Ethan remembered his father's frustration, the hours spent moving stones and dirt only to watch spring runoff erase the work in a single night. What if instead of controlling it, we used it? Evelyn's eyes lit with the kind of excitement that came from connections forming. "My father developed a system, controlled flooding, essentially. Let the water spread across the fields during peak flow, allows it to saturate the soil deeply. Then as it recedes, you plant. The moisture stays in the ground longer, carries you through the dry season. That would require infrastructure, channels, gates, a whole system. Yes, but it's possible." She pulled out her journal, sketching quickly. "If the topography is what you've described, it won't work." Ethan's voice was flat. "My father tried 10 different irrigation schemes. The land fought every one. Your father didn't have 20 years of research behind him." No insult in her tone, just fact. "He was brilliant, I'm sure, but he was improvising. I'm building on tested methodology." "Theory. Theory based on successful implementation elsewhere." Evelyn tucked the journal away. "I know you don't believe it will work, but you're still here, still helping. Why?" The question had haunted Ethan since they'd left Dry Creek. Why was he here? Why hadn't he simply refused, let her hire some other guide, kept himself safely distant from the past he'd fought so hard to escape? The answers were complicated, tangled in guilt and grief and something he didn't want to name. "Because you'd die without someone to guide you," he said finally. "And because—" he hesitated, the words difficult. "Because you're right. What happened to my family should mean something more than just tragedy. If your father's research could have saved them, could save others like them, then maybe it's worth the risk. Worth the risk for me, but what about for you?" "I'm not taking any risks. I'm just the guide." Evelyn's expression suggested she didn't believe him, but she let it pass. They rode on as the landscape grew increasingly familiar to Ethan, each landmark a knife to the heart. That was the ridge where he'd hunted elk with his father. That was the stand of cottonwoods where his sister had loved to play. Every mile brought more memories, more pain, more proof that he'd been a fool to come back. On the third evening, they camped within 10 miles of the homestead. Ethan could smell it in the air, the particular combination of sage and mineral water that characterized the spring system. They were close. By tomorrow afternoon, they'd arrive at the place where everything had ended. Ethan couldn't eat that night. His stomach was knotted with dread, and something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like anticipation. 6 years of running, of refusing to look back, and now he was hours away from confronting everything he'd fled. "Are you afraid?" Evelyn asked quietly as they sat by the fire. The question should have offended him. Instead, Ethan found himself answering honestly. Terrified. Of what? Of seeing it again, of remembering. He paused, searching for words. of finding out that I can never leave it behind, that no matter how far I run, it's always there, waiting. Maybe that's true. Evelyn's voice was gentle. Maybe some things can't be outrun. Maybe they have to be faced. And if facing them destroys me, then you'll be destroyed here, on ground that matters, instead of dying slowly on the road. She shifted closer, her face serious in the firelight. I don't claim to understand what you've lost, Mr. Hale, but I understand running. I've done my share, from my father's death, from the expectations of what an Eastern woman should be, from the safe life I could have chosen. This, coming here, trying to build something impossible, it's terrifying, but it's also the only thing that makes me feel alive. Your father's work. My work now. Our work, maybe, if you'll let it be. She held his gaze. I know you plan to leave once I'm settled. You've made that clear, but I hope you'll consider staying, at least long enough to see if it's possible, if your father's dream and mine can become real. Ethan wanted to refuse, to reaffirm his intention to guide her there and leave immediately. But the words wouldn't come, because despite everything, despite his fear, despite 6 years of self-imposed exile, despite knowing that attachment led only to loss, he wanted to see it. Wanted to know if the land that had destroyed his family could be transformed into something life-giving. If the springs his father had died protecting could sustain the kind of farm Evelyn envisioned. I'll stay until you're settled, he heard himself say. Help you assess what's salvageable. After that, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. After that, we'll see. Evelyn smiled, and Ethan realized it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Not the polite expression she wore when negotiating or the determined set of her jaw when facing challenges, but something real and warm. Thank you, Mr. Hale, for bringing me here, for trusting me with your family's land. It's not my land anymore. It's yours. Maybe. Or maybe it belongs to whoever's brave enough to try. To whoever can make something grow in ground that's tasted too much blood. She stood, preparing to sleep. Tomorrow, we arrive. Tomorrow, we start building. I know you don't believe it's possible, but I'm going to prove you wrong. After she'd settled into sleep, Ethan remained by the fire, unable to find rest. Tomorrow, they would reach the homestead. Tomorrow, he would stand on the porch where his father had died. Tomorrow, everything he'd spent 6 years trying to forget would become impossible to ignore. And beside him would be a woman who looked at failure and saw a foundation, who examined his family's graves and saw fertile ground, who carried hope and science and her own dead father's dreams into territory that had crushed stronger people. Ethan didn't know if Evelyn Moore was brave or foolish or some combination of both, but as he watched the fire burn down to coals, he found himself hoping, against all reason, against all experience, that maybe, just maybe, she was right. That maybe knowledge could succeed where determination alone had failed. That maybe the land could be something other than a graveyard. The hope felt dangerous. Hope had destroyed his father, had kept him fighting long past the point where retreat would have saved his life. Hope was the cruelest lie the frontier told. That effort mattered, that dreams could survive contact with reality, that love and will could overcome the brutal mathematics of survival. But as Ethan finally lay down, exhausted by emotion and memory, he couldn't quite extinguish the spark Evelyn Moore had kindled. Tomorrow, they would arrive. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Tomorrow, he would discover whether 6 years of running had been wisdom or cowardice. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, and the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, the same wind that had witnessed his father's death, the same wind that had heard Jacob Hale's dying gasps, the same wind that would watch whatever came next unfold with the cold neutrality of nature. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would change everything, that returning to the homestead meant confronting the man he'd been and the man he'd become, that Evelyn Moore had done what 6 years of drifting hadn't, forced him to stop running and turn to face what he'd left behind. Whether that would save him or destroy him, he couldn't say. But the journey was no longer optional. The past had caught him at last, and tomorrow he would have to answer for it. The morning they arrived at the homestead, the sky was the color of old bruises, purple and gray with streaks of sickly yellow where the sun tried to break through. Storm weather, Ethan recognized immediately, the kind that could turn violent without warning. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the land would greet their return with the promise of fury. They crested the final ridge just after noon, and there it was, the valley that had consumed his family, spread out below them like an accusation made manifest. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins so hard his knuckles went white. Jasper sensed his tension and shifted nervously beneath him. "There," Ethan said, his voice rough. He pointed to the collection of weathered structures barely visible in the distance. "That's it," Evelyn urged Sadie forward, shading her eyes against the fitful light. For a long moment she simply studied the land, the gentle slope down to the valley floor, the creek that cut through like a silver scar, the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the spring system, the buildings that had somehow survived 6 years of abandonment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that made Ethan's chest tighten. "It's perfect," she breathed. "The topography, the water access, the wind protection from those ridges. My father's notes described ideal conditions, but this exceeds them. This could actually work." Ethan wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was seeing possibility where only death existed, but the words wouldn't come. Because looking down at the homestead now, with Evelyn's eyes showing him what his own refused to see, he glimpsed what his father must have seen when they'd first arrived. The potential, the promise, the dream that had sustained Jacob Hale through every failure until it finally killed him. They descended into the valley slowly, Ethan's dread mounting with each step. The buildings grew more distinct, the house still standing miraculously, though weathered and sagging. The barn with its doors hanging open like a scream. The well housing, partially collapsed. The remains of fencing, mostly rotted or scattered by wind and time. Everything was gray and ghostly, a monument to abandonment. When they reached the house, Ethan couldn't bring himself to dismount. He sat frozen in the saddle, staring at the porch where his father had made his final stand. The wood was still dark in places, stains that could have been weather damage or could have been something else. Something that had once been red and warm and vital. "Mr. Hale?" Evelyn's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Ethan?" The use of his first name broke through his paralysis. He swung down from Jasper with wooden movements, his legs unsteady on ground he'd sworn never to stand on again. The air here smelled the same. Mineral water and sage and something indefinable that meant home, no matter how hard he'd tried to forget. Evelyn was already moving toward the house, her practical mind already assessing and planning. "The structure is sound, surprisingly so. Your father built well. The roof needs patching, and we'll have to check for rot in the floorboards, but this is salvageable. More than salvageable. This is a solid foundation." Ethan forced himself to follow her, each step an act of will. The porch boards creaked under his weight, the sound sickeningly familiar. How many times had he crossed this porch as a boy, carrying water or firewood, or hoped that tomorrow would be easier than today? The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and when Evelyn pushed it open, dust motes swirled in the dim light like disturbed spirits. Inside, everything was smaller than Ethan remembered, and infinitely more painful. The single main room that had served as kitchen, dining area, and his parents' bedroom. The loft where he and Sarah had slept, accessible by a ladder that was now missing several rungs. The fireplace his father had built stone by stone, now choked with debris and bird nests. Furniture remained, a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame, all weathered and worn but still recognizable. "Someone's been here," Evelyn said quietly, examining marks on the dusty floor. "Recently, within the last few months." Ethan's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Drifters, probably, or someone checking if the property was truly abandoned. Or whoever killed your father, making sure no one had returned to reclaim it. Evelyn met his eyes. "We should be careful. If your theory about powerful interests wanting this land is correct, our arrival won't go unnoticed for long. Then we should leave. Now before—" "No." The word was absolute. Evelyn moved through the house, opening the shutters to let in more light, her movements decisive. "This is what I came for. What we came for. I won't be frightened off by possibilities and shadows." Over the next week, they worked with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for conversation beyond the practical. Ethan told himself he was simply helping her get established before he left, that every repair he made to the house was just fulfilling his obligation as a guide. But the truth was more complicated. Each board he replaced, each section of roof he patched, felt like an apology to his father's ghost. Like he was finally doing what he should have done 6 years ago, staying, fighting, building. Evelyn worked beside him from dawn to dusk, her Eastern refinement revealing itself as a surface layer over genuine capability. She could hammer nails straight, could lift her share of weight, could work through exhaustion without complaint. They fell into an easy rhythm, Ethan's experience with construction complementing Evelyn's meticulous planning. She'd spread her father's research across the repaired table each evening, cross-referencing the land's features with her notes, making plans for irrigation channels and crop rotations, and structures that didn't exist yet except in her determined imagination. "The spring system is even better than the surveys suggested," she said one evening, her face smudged with dirt and alight with excitement. 3 separate sources feeding into the creek, all with different mineral compositions. If we channel them correctly, we could irrigate 15 acres easily, maybe 20. The soil testing I've done shows good structure, just needs organic matter worked in. This could support not just wheat, but vegetables, even experimental crops. "Evelyn," Ethan interrupted her, using her first name without thinking. They dropped formalities somewhere between repairing the barn door and clearing the well. "Slow down. You're talking about years of work." "Yes. And?" She looked at him with that mix of determination and hope that had become familiar. "That's what building something lasting requires: time, effort, belief that it's possible." "Belief doesn't stop bullets." The words came out harsher than intended. "You're making yourself a target. Every improvement you make, every sign that this place might actually succeed, it draws attention from the kind of people who don't want it to succeed." "I know." No fear in her voice, just acceptance. "But I didn't come here to fail quietly. If someone wants to stop me, they'll have to face me directly." That night, Ethan lay awake in the barn loft. He'd insisted Evelyn take the house while he made do with the space he'd once hidden in like a coward. The building still smelled of hay and animal sweat, still echoed with the memory of gunshots and his father's final cries. He stared up at the rafters his father had hewn by hand and wondered what Jacob Hale would think of Evelyn Moore, this Eastern woman who'd bought his failure and saw only opportunity. He'd be proud of her, Ethan realized, and he'd be ashamed of his son for planning to leave. The thought kept him awake until dawn. 2 weeks into their work, the first sign of real trouble arrived. Ethan was repairing fence posts in the eastern pasture when he spotted dust on the horizon. 3 riders approaching at a deliberate pace. Not drifters, not travelers. Men with purpose and destination. He dropped his tools and ran for the house. "Evelyn, get inside." She emerged from the garden plot she'd been preparing, soil on her hands, confusion on her face. "What?" "Riders coming. Could be nothing. Could be everything." Ethan grabbed his rifle from inside the door, checking the load with practiced efficiency. "Stay in the house. Let me talk to them." "If this is about the land, I should—" "Stay. Inside." He met her eyes. "Please. If this goes wrong, ride for Dry Creek. Don't stop. Don't look back. Tell Coleman Briggs what happened. He'll know what to do." Before Evelyn could argue, the riders arrived. 3 men, all armed, all carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. The lead rider was older, weathered, with eyes that assessed the homestead with calculating precision. His companions were younger, harder, the kind of hired muscle that did dirty work for clean money. "This is private property," Ethan called out, positioning himself between the riders and the house. "State your business or move on." The lead rider smiled without warmth. "Private property. That's interesting because last I checked, this land had been claimed by the territorial authority. Been sitting abandoned for years." "Not abandoned anymore. The owner's here." "The owner?" The man's eyes flicked to the house where Evelyn had appeared in the doorway despite Ethan's instructions. That would be Miss Evelyn Moore, late of Pennsylvania. Purchased the property through the land office for a surprisingly reasonable sum. His smile widened. "I represent parties interested in acquiring this parcel. We're prepared to offer Miss Moore triple what she paid, plus expenses for her trouble." Evelyn stepped onto the porch, and Ethan's heart sank. He'd seen that expression before, on his father's face, right before things went catastrophically wrong. Determination that wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, wouldn't listen to reason. "I'm not interested in selling," she said clearly. "I purchased this land legally to conduct agricultural research. It's not for sale at any price." The lead writer's expression hardened. "That's unfortunate. My employers are used to getting what they want, Miss Moore. It would be simpler for everyone if you accepted their generous offer and returned east where you belong." "I belong here, on my land, doing my work." Evelyn descended the porch steps, ignoring Ethan's warning look. "Tell your employers that this property is not available and will not become available. Now leave." For a moment, tension stretched taut as wire. The two younger riders shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Ethan raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, not yet, but making his presence felt. The mathematics of violence were clear. 3 against 1, with Evelyn caught in the middle. Even if Ethan shot first, shot true, someone would die. The lead rider assessed the situation with professional calm, then nodded slowly. "As you wish, Miss Moore, but consider this carefully. Wyoming territory is a dangerous place. Accidents happen. Buildings burn, people disappear. It would be a shame if your research ended in tragedy." "Is that a threat?" Evelyn's voice remained steady. "It's a warning, from someone who's seen how these situations typically resolve." He tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "We'll be in touch. If you reconsider, and I sincerely hope you will, leave word at the trading post in Dry Creek. The offer remains open for now." They rode away slowly, 3 figures disappearing into the vast landscape like smoke. Ethan waited until they were completely out of sight before lowering his rifle, his hands shaking with delayed reaction. "You should have stayed inside, Chad," he said, anger covering his fear. "You should have let me handle them." "They came about my land. My decision." Evelyn's face was pale but composed. "I won't hide, Ethan. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. Fear would be appropriate. They just threatened your life. They threatened everyone who doesn't capitulate to their demands. That's how bullies operate." She turned back toward the house. "My father dealt with similar pressure, corporate interests trying to buy his research, suppress his findings. He refused to be intimidated. So will I." Ethan wanted to shake her, to make her understand that principle was a luxury purchased with blood. But watching her walk back toward the garden she'd been preparing, shoulders straight, head high, refusing to be driven from her purpose, he recognized something that made his chest ache. Courage. Real courage. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate action. His father had possessed that same courage. It had gotten him killed. The confrontation changed everything. What had been theoretical danger became concrete threat. Ethan found himself unable to sleep, spending his nights watching the approaches to the homestead, rifle across his lap, waiting for the violence he knew was coming. Evelyn worked during the days with focused intensity, as if trying to accomplish as much as possible before the hammer fell. They didn't speak about the riders, but the threat hung between them like smoke. When Ethan suggested she leave, take the offer, save her life, Evelyn dismissed him with a look that made further argument pointless. When he proposed riding to Fort Kearney to report the intimidation, she pointed out that territorial authority was likely complicit. Someone had made his family's land available for purchase, after all. Someone with official power wanted this property, and legal recourse was probably impossible. So they worked and waited, building during daylight what forces beyond their control would likely destroy in darkness. 3 weeks after the rider's visit, Ethan woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of the barn before conscious thought, rifle in one hand, boots unlaced, his worst nightmare made manifest. Orange light flickered in the darkness. The barn was burning. Not the barn he slept in, but the one they'd repaired together, the one where Evelyn had stored her shipped supplies, her father's research materials, months of carefully gathered seed stock. "Evelyn!" He screamed her name, running toward the house. She appeared in the doorway, wearing only her nightdress, her face frozen in horror as she saw the flames. "The research!" she gasped. "Everything! My father's work!" She started toward the burning structure, and Ethan tackled her, dragging her back as the roof collapsed inward with a roar of flame and fury. Heat washed over them, intense enough to singe exposed skin even from 30 feet away. The horses, they'd moved the horses to the eastern pasture earlier that week, thank every force in the universe. But everything else was gone. They watched the barn burn, Evelyn shaking in Ethan's arms, both of them powerless against the destruction. The fire lit the valley like false dawn, bright and terrible. When the structure finally collapsed completely, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky, Ethan heard Evelyn make a sound he'd never heard from her, a broken sob that came from somewhere deep and wounded. "They won," she whispered. "They burned it all. Years of work, my father's legacy, everything I brought, it's gone." Ethan tightened his arms around her, his own chest hollow with rage and grief. He knew exactly who'd done this. The same forces that had killed his father now targeted Evelyn, using fire instead of bullets, but with the same ruthless intent. Drive away the dreamers, destroy the hope, make the land too costly to claim. "No," he said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "They haven't won, not yet." Evelyn pulled back to look at him, her face smudged with ash and tears. "How can you say that? Buildings burn, materials burn, but you're alive, the land's still here, the springs still flow." He cupped her face in his hands, making her meet his eyes. "My father died defending this place because he believed it mattered. Your father died believing this work needed to be done. That belief doesn't burn, Evelyn. That survives everything. The research notes that can be recreated. Your father's work is in your head, in your hands, in everything you've already done here." He felt something shift inside him. 6 years of running, finally stopping, finally finding ground solid enough to stand on. They thought fire would break you. They were wrong. Were they? Her voice was small, lost. "I came here so certain, so prepared, but this, I don't know if I'm strong enough to—" "You are." Ethan kissed her forehead, the gesture surprising them both. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You looked at my family's failure and saw possibility. You stood up to armed men threatening your life. You worked until your hands bled building something you believed in. Fire doesn't change that. It just proves how much they fear what you're trying to do." Dawn was breaking, gray and cold. In its light, the destroyed barn looked even worse, a skeleton of charred timber and ash. But Evelyn was stirring in his arms, the initial shock giving way to something else. Something that looked like anger, righteous and pure. "They're trying to drive me away," she said slowly. "Make me give up, take their money and leave." "Yes. They think I'm alone, vulnerable." Her jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "They're wrong about that too, aren't they?" Ethan understood what she was asking, not just about this moment, but about everything. About whether he would stay or run. About whether he would finally stand his ground on the land where his father had fallen. About whether he was brave enough to believe that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. "They're wrong," he said, and felt the last 6 years of running finally stop. "You're not alone. You never were." The kiss that followed was inevitable, fierce, tasting of smoke and salt and defiance. Ethan poured 6 years of exile into it, 6 years of loneliness and grief, and the desperate need to matter to someone, to something. Evelyn kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer as if she could anchor herself to his sudden, certain presence. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun had risen enough to paint the valley in shades of gold that made the burned barn look almost bearable, almost like it could be rebuilt. "I love you," Ethan said, the words rough and unpracticed. "I didn't want to. Tried not to. But I love you, Evelyn Moore. Love your stubborn hope and your impossible dreams, and the way you looked at my failure and saw foundation." He touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw. "I'm staying. Not just until you're settled. I'm staying, fighting, building, whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes," Evelyn repeated, and there was fire in her eyes now. Not the destructive fire that had consumed the barn, but something else. Something that could forge steel. "They want a war?" We'll give them one. They spent that day in the ruins, salvaging what little could be saved. Most of the supplies were destroyed, but some of the seed stock had been stored in metal containers that had survived the heat. The research notes were lost, but Evelyn began recreating them from memory, her mind proving to be the best archive after all. They found evidence of accelerants, lamp oil splashed across the walls before ignition, professional arson meant to destroy completely. "They'll come back," Ethan said as they worked. "This was meant to drive you away. When it doesn't, they'll escalate." "Let them." Evelyn's voice was hard. "I'm done being afraid. Done letting bullies control who gets to dream and who has to surrender." "Then we need help. Can't do this alone." Ethan was already thinking strategically, his mind working through possibilities. "There are other ranchers in the area, small operators who resent the big combines. If we can convince them that your research could help them survive independent of corporate control, they might stand with us." Hope flickered in Evelyn's eyes. "Create a coalition. Present a united front. It's a risk. Some of them might be in the corporation's pockets, but it's our best chance." He paused, considering. "We also need legal protection. If we can prove you own this land legally, make it a matter of public record." "The Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne." Evelyn nodded quickly, her tactical mind engaging. "If we file the deed publicly, get witnesses, make it impossible to claim the sale was irregular. It won't stop them from trying violence, but it makes that violence a matter of record, gives us legal standing if we survive long enough to use it." Ethan met her eyes. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. You understand that?" "I understand." No hesitation. "But I'm not fighting alone anymore. That changes everything." They worked through the afternoon, planning strategy with the same meticulous care Evelyn had brought to her agricultural research. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow, Ethan realized something had fundamentally shifted. The homestead was no longer just the place where his father had died. It was the place where he would finally make his stand, where he would stop running and start building, where he would prove that loss didn't have to be the end of the story. That night they sat together on the porch. His father had died defending, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Evelyn leaned against Ethan's shoulder, exhausted but unbroken. The burned barn was a dark shape against the horizon, testament to their enemy's power and their own vulnerability. "Tell me about your father," Evelyn said softly. "Not about his death, about his life. About who he was when he believed things were possible." So Ethan talked, and for the first time in 6 years the memories didn't drown him. He spoke about Jacob Hale's laugh, about the way his father would stand in the fields at dawn and talk about potential like it was something you could harvest, about his mother's quiet strength and Sarah's bright curiosity, about the family they'd been before the land had taken them one by one. "They'd like you," he said finally. "My father especially. You've got his fire, his refusal to quit, and you've got his courage, even if you don't see it yet." Evelyn laced her fingers through his. "Running wasn't cowardice, Ethan. It was survival, but staying is choice. That's what makes it brave." The wind carried the smell of smoke and sage, of water and possibility. Somewhere in the darkness, forces were gathering against them. Men with money and power who wanted this land for reasons that had nothing to do with dreams and everything to do with control. They would come again, with fire or bullets or legal machinations meant to destroy what Evelyn was building. But for the first time since his father's death, Ethan wasn't afraid of the fight, because this time he wasn't alone. This time he had someone worth fighting for, worth standing beside when the hammer finally fell. They'd burned the barn, tried to break Evelyn's spirit and drive her away. Instead, they'd forged something neither Ethan nor Evelyn had expected, a partnership born in fire, tempered by shared purpose, strong enough to withstand whatever came next. The land stretched around them, vast and harsh and beautiful in its brutality. His father had died believing it could be more than a graveyard. Evelyn had traveled across the country believing the same thing, and now Ethan believed it too. Not because belief came easily, but because sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to fight like hell for the living. Tomorrow, they would ride to the neighboring ranches, would begin building the coalition they needed to survive. would take the first steps toward making this homestead something more than a monument to failure. The battle was just beginning, and the odds were terrible. But for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Hale was done running. He'd found his ground, found his reason, found the woman who'd looked at his broken past and seen the possibility of a future worth building. They sat together as darkness claimed the valley, two people against impossible odds, and neither of them looked away from what was coming. They'd chosen their ground. Now they would defend it, whatever it took. The morning after the fire, Ethan and Evelyn rode out before dawn, heading east toward the Bridger Ranch. Thomas Bridger was a taciturn man who'd been homesteading in Wyoming territory for 15 years, long enough to have earned both respect and scars. If anyone would understand the threat they faced, it would be Bridger. They found him mending fence in his eastern pasture, a wiry man in his 50s with hands like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. He straightened when he saw them approach, his expression cautious until he recognized Ethan. "Hale." Surprise flickered across Bridger's face. "Heard you'd sworn off this country for good." "Heard wrong, apparently." Ethan dismounted, keeping his movements casual despite the urgency thrumming through his veins. "Tom, this is Evelyn Moore. She owns my family's old homestead now. We need to talk." Bridger's eyes moved to Evelyn, assessing. "A woman alone, owning land out here. That's asking for trouble." "She's not alone." The words came out harder than Ethan intended. "And the trouble's already found us. That's why we're here." They spent an hour in Bridger's sparse cabin, laying out everything: the purchase of the land, Evelyn's research goals, the threatening visit, the barn burning. Bridger listened without interruption, his face growing darker as the story unfolded. "Continental Cattle Company," he said finally, naming the entity Ethan had suspected. "They've been buying up water rights across the territory for 2 years now. Small operators who won't sell find themselves facing mysterious livestock deaths, fence cutting, worse. Most eventually take whatever price they're offered and leave." "You?" Evelyn asked. "Still here, but they haven't pressed me hard yet. My land's marginal, doesn't have the water access yours does." Bridger studied Evelyn with new interest. "This research of yours, agricultural improvements that don't require corporate infrastructure, that threatens their business model directly." "That's the idea." Evelyn leaned forward. "Independent settlers who can sustain themselves don't need to buy from company stores, don't need to lease water rights, don't need corporate loans. They can actually own their future instead of renting it." Noble thought. Also dangerous as hell, but respect had entered Bridger's voice. "You know what you're up against?" "We're learning." Ethan met the older man's eyes. "We're also not backing down, but we can't do this alone. Need to know if you'll stand with us when they come again, because they will come." Bridger was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll stand. Been pushed around by Continental long enough. Someone needs to show them they can't just take whatever they want." He paused. "But it can't be just the 3 of us. We need numbers. Enough that they can't pick us off individually." "Who else?" Evelyn pulled out a small notebook. "Who else is independent, has reason to resist?" They spent the next hour compiling names. Margaret Chen, a widow running her late husband's ranch through sheer stubborn will. The Morrison brothers, young and idealistic and deeply in debt to Continental's lending arm. Samuel Ortega, whose family had been in the territory since before it was a territory, who'd watched Mexican land grants get stolen through legal manipulation and had no love for corporate interests. By midday, they had a list of 8 potential allies: small operators, struggling homesteaders, people who had more to gain from Evelyn's success than from Continental's continued dominance. It wasn't much. Against a company with seemingly unlimited resources and territorial officials in their pocket, 8 ranchers with limited means were barely a speed bump. But it was more than nothing. It was the beginning of something. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Evelyn rode a circuit across the territory, visiting each name on their list. Some refused immediately, too frightened or too dependent on Continental's goodwill to risk opposition. Others listened with cautious interest but wouldn't commit. But slowly, painfully, they built their coalition. 5 ranchers agreed to stand with them. 5 families willing to risk everything on the principle that the land should belong to the people who worked it, not to distant corporations that saw only profit margins. It wasn't enough. Ethan knew it wasn't enough, but it was 5 more than they'd had before. They returned to the homestead to find another message waiting, this time delivered with less subtlety. Someone had slaughtered 3 of their horses, leaving the bodies in the creek to poison the water supply. The remaining animals had scattered in terror. It took 2 days to round them up, and another full day to drag the carcasses far enough away to prevent contamination. "They're escalating," Ethan said as they worked, both of them exhausted and filthy. "Trying to make survival impossible, even if we won't leave voluntarily. Then we adapt." Evelyn's voice was grim but steady. "Move the animals every night, post watches, make ourselves harder targets." "For how long? We can't live under siege forever." "Then we end the siege." She straightened, pushing sweat-soaked hair from her face. "We go on the offensive, stop reacting, and start acting." That night they gathered their small coalition in Bridger's barn, the 5 ranchers who'd committed, plus 3 of their grown children who'd volunteered to help. 11 people total against an organization that could hire 50 guns without blinking. Ethan stood before them, feeling the weight of leadership he'd never wanted and couldn't refuse. Continental Cattle Company wants to control water rights across the Northern Territory. They've been buying land through intimidation, legal manipulation, and when necessary, violence. Miss Moore's property sits on one of the best spring systems in the region. They've tried buying it. They've tried burning her out. Next, they'll try killing us. "So what do we do?" Margaret Chen asked. She was in her 60s, her face lined by decades of harsh weather and harder choices. "We can't outfight them." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but we can outmaneuver them, make them fight on legal and social ground instead of violent confrontation." She spread papers across a makeshift table, territorial maps, water right documents, her father's research. Continental's been operating in a gray area, using threat and bribery but always maintaining plausible deniability. We force them into the light, make their actions matter of public record. "How?" Samuel Ortega's voice was skeptical. "First, we formalize our coalition legally, file as an agricultural cooperative with the territorial government. That gives us standing as an organization, not just individuals." Evelyn's finger traced lines on the map. "Second, we petition the territorial legislature to review water rights allocations, force a public hearing where Continental has to justify their claims." "They own half the legislature," one of the Morrison brothers objected. "Maybe. But sunlight is a powerful disinfectant. Make the corruption public, and even bought politicians have to maintain appearances." Ethan picked up the thread. "Third, we reach out to newspapers, Eastern papers specifically. The territories are a popular topic back east. Corporations crushing independent settlers makes good copy." "You think Continental cares about bad publicity?" Bridger's tone was doubtful. "Their investors do. Their board of directors does." Evelyn's eyes were bright with strategic thinking. Continental Cattle Company is owned by a conglomerate with holdings in multiple states. Bad press affects stock prices, shareholder confidence. We make this expensive for them in ways beyond just stubborn resistance. The plan was ambitious, probably impossible, and absolutely their only chance. Over the next hour, they refined the details, assigned roles, prepared for every contingency they could imagine. When the meeting finally broke up near midnight, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not quite hope. He'd learned better than that, but something close. Purpose, maybe. The sense that he was finally fighting for something instead of running from everything. The next morning, Ethan and Evelyn rode to Cheyenne to file the cooperative paperwork. The territorial capital was a raucous collection of permanent buildings and temporary structures, swollen with miners, ranchers, businessmen, and the opportunists who followed money like flies to carrion. The territorial offices were in a squat brick building that promised official permanence in a landscape defined by transience. The clerk who received their cooperative filing was a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and the harried look of someone perpetually overwhelmed. He reviewed their documents with bureaucratic thoroughness, occasionally glancing up at Evelyn with poorly concealed surprise that a woman was the primary filer. "This appears in order," he said finally. "There's a processing fee, and it takes 2 weeks for official registration, but I don't see any obvious problems with—" "There's a significant problem." The new voice came from behind them, smooth and confident. Ethan turned to find a well-dressed man in his 40s, carrying himself with the assured authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Moore's claim to the property in question is disputed. Filing a cooperative based on disputed land seems premature. Disputed by whom? Evelyn's voice remained calm, but Ethan heard the steel underneath. By Continental Cattle Company. I'm Richard Ashford, their territorial representative. He smiled without warmth. We have documentation showing that the land in question was improperly seized and sold. The original owner's debts were settled post-mortem, making the territorial sale invalid. Ethan's blood went cold. That's a lie. My father died with those debts unpaid. The land was stolen legally. Your father? Ashford's eyes sharpened with interest. Ethan Hale, I presume. How convenient that you've returned after 6 years to contest a sale you previously showed no interest in. Because I thought my family's killers had won. Thought there was no point fighting a system rigged against us. Ethan stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. But I was wrong. The system's corrupt, but it's not invincible, and we're not going quietly. Bold words. Ashford's expression hardened. But words don't change legal realities. Continental has filed a claim dispute with the territorial court. Until it's resolved, Miss Moore's ownership is questionable at best. Then let's resolve it. Evelyn met Ashford's gaze directly. Public hearing, full transparency. Let a judge review all the documents, ours and yours, and make a determination based on law, not influence. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in Ashford's eyes. That's not how these matters are typically handled. I'm not asking about typical, I'm asking about legal. Evelyn turned to the clerk, who'd been watching the exchange with wide-eyed alarm. File our cooperative paperwork. Note that Continental Cattle Company has contested ownership. Request a formal hearing to resolve the dispute. All of that is standard procedure, correct? The clerk swallowed hard, caught between competing pressures. Yes, technically, but then do it. Evelyn's voice allowed no room for argument. Unless there's some reason legal procedures shouldn't be followed. The challenge was clear. Refuse and admit that Continental operated outside the law. Accept and face a public hearing where their methods would be exposed to scrutiny. Ashford's jaw tightened, clearly recognizing the trap, but unable to avoid it without revealing the corruption everyone suspected, but no one could prove. File it, he said finally to the clerk, then turned back to Evelyn. But understand, Miss Moore, that Continental Cattle Company has significant resources. Legal battles can take years, cost fortunes. Are you prepared for that? Are you? Evelyn's smile was sharp as a blade. Because I have nothing to lose. Everything I own is already committed to this fight. But Continental, how will your investors react to years of expensive litigation over a single homestead? To headlines about corporate giants crushing independent settlers? To questions about how you acquired other properties in the territory? Ashford's expression went cold. You're making a serious mistake. The only mistake would be not fighting. Ethan moved to stand beside Evelyn, presenting a united front. Continental killed my father, tried to kill our dreams. We're done being victims. This ends in court, in the light, where everyone can see exactly what you've been doing. They left the territorial offices with the cooperative paperwork filed and a hearing scheduled for 6 weeks hence. It was a small victory, barely even a victory at all. Just the right to make their case in a system that was probably rigged against them. But it was more than Ethan's father had ever gotten, more than any of Continental's previous targets had managed. It was a chance. The ride back to the homestead took 2 days, and they used the time to refine their strategy. Evelyn's mind was always working, always planning, finding angles and approaches that Ethan's more straightforward thinking missed. She'd inherited her father's methodical intelligence, the ability to see problems as puzzles to be solved rather than walls to be confronted. We need documentation, she said, as they made camp the first night. Every incident of intimidation, every suspicious land transfer, every time Continental operated outside legal bounds. If we can show a pattern of behavior, establish that my case isn't isolated, then we're not just fighting for your homestead, we're exposing their entire operation. Ethan poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. That makes us even more dangerous to them. Yes. No hesitation, no fear. Which means they'll escalate again. We need to be ready. They were riding through a narrow canyon the next afternoon when the attack came. 6 riders appeared from cover on both sides of the trail, weapons drawn, cutting off escape. Professional ambush executed with military precision. Ethan's hand went to his revolver, but he knew the mathematics were hopeless. 6 against 2, caught in a kill zone with no cover. If they wanted him and Evelyn dead, they were dead. But the lead rider, not Ashford but someone harder, someone who'd clearly done this kind of work before, simply sat his horse and smiled. "Miss Moore, Mr. Hale, my employer would like to renegotiate." "Not interested." Ethan kept his voice level despite his racing heart. "You haven't heard the new terms. Triple the original offer for the land, plus a generous payment for emotional distress and destroyed property, plus safe passage out of the territory with no further interference." The rider's smile widened. "All you have to do is drop the legal challenge and leave. Today. And if we refuse?" Evelyn's hands were steady on her reins, betraying nothing of what she must be feeling. "Then my employer will be very disappointed. And disappointed employers make unfortunate decisions." The threat was clear without being explicit. "This is your last chance for a peaceful resolution, Miss Moore. Take it." Ethan looked at Evelyn, saw her jaw set in that familiar stubborn line, and knew what her answer would be before she spoke. Part of him wanted to beg her to accept, to save her life, even if it meant surrendering everything. But a larger part, the part that was finally learning to stand instead of run, understood that some things couldn't be surrendered. Some battles had to be fought regardless of the odds. "Tell your employer," Evelyn said clearly, "that he can't buy what isn't for sale. The land stays mine. The cooperative stands. The hearing proceeds. And if he sends more men to threaten us, we'll document every incident and present it to the territorial judge." The rider's expression hardened. "You're making a fatal mistake. Then we'll die standing." Ethan moved Jasper closer to Evelyn's horse, a gesture of solidarity. "But we'll take enough of you with us that your employer will have to explain why he needed to murder settlers to acquire water rights. Think that'll play well in the newspapers?" For a long moment, violence hung in the air like a held breath. The rider's hands rested on weapons, waiting for the order to draw. Ethan calculated trajectories. He might get 2 shots off before they killed him, might buy Evelyn a few seconds to run. It wouldn't be enough, but it was all he had. Then the lead rider laughed, a sound without humor. "You've got spine, I'll give you that. Stupid, but spine." He gestured to his men, who reluctantly lowered their weapons. "We'll see how brave you feel when the real pressure starts." 6 weeks until your hearing, Miss Moore. A lot can happen in 6 weeks. They rode away, disappearing back into the rocks like violent ghosts. Ethan's hands were shaking with delayed reaction, his breath coming in short gasps. Beside him, Evelyn sat very still, her face pale, but composed. "We should have taken the offer," Ethan said, his voice rough. "We're going to die for this land." "Maybe." Evelyn finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. "But we'll die free. Die fighting for something that matters. That's more than most people get." They rode on in silence, both understanding that they'd crossed a threshold. Continental had shown its hand, willing to kill, willing to do whatever necessary to acquire what it wanted. The next 6 weeks would be a countdown to violence, each day bringing them closer to a confrontation that at least one of them probably wouldn't survive. When they reached the homestead 2 days later, they found their coalition waiting. All 5 ranchers, plus their families, standing in defensive positions around the property. Bridger stepped forward as Ethan and Evelyn dismounted. Heard about the filing in Cheyenne. Figured Continental would respond. His weathered face showed concern. "Thought you might need backup." "We do." Ethan felt something warm and unexpected in his chest. "Thank you." "We stand together or hang separately?" Margaret Chen's voice was matter-of-fact. "That's how it works out here." Over the next weeks, they transformed the homestead into something defensible. Sentries were posted in shifts, the buildings were fortified, supplies were stockpiled. Word spread through the territory about the cooperative's legal challenge, and slowly, more people joined, not openly, afraid of Continental's retaliation, but in quiet ways. Information about other suspicious land deals, testimony about intimidation, documentation of the pattern. Evelyn had known must exist. 3 weeks before the hearing, Continental tried a different approach. A woman arrived at the homestead, well-dressed, articulate, claiming to represent a consortium of Eastern investors interested in agricultural research. She offered Evelyn full funding for her work, complete independence, in exchange for moving her research to a different location. No need to fight over this particular land when there was so much available territory. Ethan watched Evelyn's face as she listened to the offer, saw the temptation war with principle. It was everything she'd said she wanted: resources to conduct research, freedom to pursue her father's dream. All she had to do was abandon the homestead and the people who'd stood with her. "No," Evelyn said finally. "This land matters. Not just to me, but to everyone Continental's pushed around. If I leave, if I accept that money might makes right, then I've betrayed everything my father believed, everything your coalition risked by standing with me." The woman's pleasant expression fractured slightly. "You're choosing principle over pragmatism. That's admirable and foolish in equal measure." "Maybe, but I can live with foolish. I can't live with cowardice." After the woman left, Ethan pulled Evelyn aside. "You could have taken that offer, found another place to build your research station." "No, I couldn't." She turned to face him fully. "Because this was never just about the research. It's about proving that people have a right to defend what's theirs, that corporations don't get to steal through intimidation and call it business. Your father understood that. He died defending that principle." Her voice softened. "I won't dishonor his sacrifice by running from the same fight." 2 weeks before the hearing, Continental made its final move, not against the homestead directly, but against the weakest members of their coalition. The Morrison brothers woke to find their cattle poisoned, their barn burned, and a note promising more destruction if they testified at the hearing. Samuel Ortega faced a sudden tax assessment that would bankrupt him unless he sold his land immediately. Margaret Chen's water rights were challenged through official channels, threatening her livelihood. Systematic pressure, applied with corporate efficiency, designed to fracture their coalition before the hearing could even begin. Ethan and Evelyn rode through a circuit of visits, shoring up resolve, providing what help they could. But resources were thin, and Continentals were seemingly endless. One by one, their allies began to waver. Not because they weren't brave, but because bravery didn't feed families or pay off debts. 5 days before the hearing, Thomas Bridger appeared at the homestead with news that made Ethan's blood run cold. Continentals bringing in professional guns. 20 men, all with reputations for violence. They're not planning to wait for the hearing. They're going to hit us first, break the coalition, make the legal challenge irrelevant. When? Ethan's hand went to his rifle. Soon. Maybe days. The talk in Cheyenne is that Continental's board of directors issued an ultimatum: end this challenge by any means necessary before it becomes a precedent other territories could follow. That night, Ethan stood watch on the homestead's eastern ridge, rifle across his lap, staring into darkness that could hide any number of threats. Evelyn found him there just after midnight, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Can't stop thinking about my father. About the night he died." Ethan's voice was distant. He stood on that porch knowing he'd probably die. Stood there anyway because he believed the land was worth defending. "I thought he was a fool. And now? Now I understand. Some things you can't run from. Some things you have to face, even when the odds are impossible." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd traveled across the country chasing her father's dream, who'd stood up to threats that would have broken stronger people. "I love you, Evelyn. Whatever happens in the next few days, I need you to know that. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to stand and fight instead of running away." "I love you too." She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together in the darkness, two people facing impossible odds with nothing but stubborn hope and each other. "We're going to lose, aren't we? The hearing, the fight, everything." "Probably." Ethan wouldn't lie to her, wouldn't offer false comfort. "Continental has more money, more men, more power. We're just a handful of homesteaders with principle and not much else. Then we make our stand anyway. Make it mean something." Evelyn's voice strengthened. "Even if we lose, even if they kill us, we'll have fought. We'll have shown that some people won't be bought or intimidated. That has to count for something." It counts for everything. Ethan kissed her, tasting salt and determination. Your father would be proud. Mine too. They sat together watching stars wheel overhead, knowing that violence was coming, knowing they were likely facing their last days, but refusing to let fear dictate action. They'd found each other on this harsh land, had built something precious from grief and hope and stubborn determination. Whether they survived the coming storm didn't change the truth of what they'd created. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the valley in shades of gold that made even the burned barn beautiful. Somewhere to the east, Continental's hired guns were riding toward them. Somewhere in Cheyenne, lawyers were preparing arguments that would determine who owned the right to dream. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the future waited, uncertain, dangerous, precious. But here, now, on this homestead, where so much had been lost and so much found, Ethan Hale stood his ground. He'd stopped running. He'd found his reason to fight, and beside him stood a woman who'd looked at his failure and seen foundation, who'd taken his family's graves and planted seeds of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Standing on ground that mattered, defending dreams that were worth the price, refusing to let fear or force or corporate power dictate who got to build a future in this harsh and beautiful land. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Hale felt like he was finally home. The attack came 3 days before the scheduled hearing, just as the sun dipped below the western ridge and shadows stretched long across the valley. Ethan was checking the livestock in the eastern pasture when he heard the first gunshot, a sharp crack that sent birds exploding from the cottonwoods in panicked flight. He was running before the echo faded, rifle in hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The homestead appeared through the gathering dusk, figures on horseback circling the buildings, muzzle flashes bright in the dimness. More shots, the sound of breaking glass, someone screaming. 20 riders, just as Bridger had warned, professional and ruthless. But Continental had made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed their targets would be isolated, vulnerable, easy to crush. Instead, they found the coalition waiting. All 5 ranching families had gathered at the homestead that morning, understanding that the attack was inevitable, and choosing to face it together rather than being picked off one by one. Ethan reached the barn to find Thomas Bridger and Samuel Ortega firing from the loft, their shots disciplined and measured. Margaret Chen was at the house window, reloading with practiced efficiency between volleys. The Morrison brothers held the well housing, providing crossfire that kept the attackers from getting close to the main buildings. "About time!" Bridger shouted down at Ethan. "They hit us 10 minutes ago. Tried to burn the house, but Evelyn put it out." "Where is she?" Panic edged Ethan's voice. "Root cellar, with the other women and children. Safe for now." Bridger fired again, and one of the attackers clutched his shoulder, wheeling his horse away. "But we can't hold this forever. They're professionals. We're just—" His words were cut off by a new sound. Hoofbeats approaching from the south, many of them, moving fast. Ethan's stomach dropped. Reinforcements for Continental. This was over. They'd made their stand and it hadn't been enough. But then he saw the riders crest the southern ridge, and his breath caught in disbelief. At least 30 of them, ranchers and homesteaders from across the territory, men and women who'd heard about the cooperative's legal challenge and decided that silence was the same as complicity. They swept down into the valley like a cavalry charge, rifles raised, their arrival so unexpected that Continental's hired guns froze in confusion. The lead rider was a massive man Ethan recognized, Carl Hendricks, who ran cattle 50 miles northeast and had a reputation for absolute honesty and absolute stubbornness. "Figured you could use some help," Hendricks bellowed, firing a shot that went nowhere near anyone but made his intentions clear. Territory's tired of Continental pushing people around. The mathematics of the fight shifted dramatically. What had been 20 against 11 suddenly became 20 against 40 plus. Continental's hired guns were professionals, but professionals understood when odds turned impossible. Their leader, the same man who'd ambushed Ethan and Evelyn weeks earlier, assessed the situation with cold calculation and made the only sensible choice. "Pull back," he shouted to his men. "This isn't worth dying for." They retreated in good order, professional to the last, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The newcomers pursued them to the valley's edge, then stopped, content to ensure they were truly leaving rather than seeking additional violence. Ethan ran to the root cellar, pulling open the heavy door with hands that shook. Evelyn emerged first, soot-streaked and fierce, a shovel clutched in her hands like a weapon. When she saw him alive and whole, something in her expression broke, and she threw herself into his arms with enough force to stagger him. "I thought, when I heard the shots..." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "I'm fine. Oh, we're fine. Everyone's..." He looked around frantically, doing a quick count of the coalition members who'd stood with them. The Morrison brothers both accounted for, Margaret Chen emerging from the house, Ortega climbing down from the barn. Bridger. "Where's Tom?" Ethan's voice sharpened with fear. "Here." Bridger appeared from around the barn, supporting his right arm with his left hand. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Caught one in the shoulder. I'll live, but I won't be doing any heavy lifting for a while." Margaret Chen was already moving toward him with clean cloth and whiskey, the frontier woman's medical kit. The rest of the families emerged from cover, checking on each other with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to violence but not immune to its costs. Miraculously, Bridger was the only serious injury. A few grazes, some cuts from flying glass, but nothing that wouldn't heal. They'd survived. Against impossible odds and professional killers, they'd stood their ground and survived. Carl Hendricks dismounted, his weathered face serious as he approached Ethan and Evelyn. "Heard about your cooperative in Cheyenne. Heard about Continental trying to break you before the hearing. Figured it was time people made a choice. Stand with neighbors or watch them get picked off one by one." "You came." Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. "All of you. We didn't even ask. Didn't need to ask. What's happening to you is what Continental wants to do to all of us eventually." Hendricks gestured to the assembled riders, a cross-section of Wyoming Territory's independent settlers. "They think money and violence can control who gets to live here, who gets to thrive. Someone showed them they're wrong." That night, the homestead blazed with firelight and voices as 40-plus people gathered in solidarity. They shared food, tended wounds, and made plans. What had started as Evelyn's personal fight had become something larger, a referendum on whether the territory would be controlled by corporate interests or remain open to independent settlers. "The hearing's in 3 days," Evelyn said, standing before the assembled group. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, highlighting the determination that had carried her across the country to this moment. "Continental will use legal arguments, but what happened today proves their real methodology. They're willing to kill to get what they want. We need to make sure the territorial judge knows that." "How?" Margaret Chen asked. "Men like that aren't above taking bribes." "Then we make it public. So public that bribery becomes impossible." Evelyn pulled papers from her satchel, the documentation they'd gathered over weeks of investigation. Every suspicious land transfer, every incident of intimidation, every family driven out by Continental's pressure. We present it all in open court, invite newspaper reporters from Cheyenne and beyond. Make this about more than just my homestead. Make it about whether the territory will be a place where honest people can build futures or just another corporate holding. Samuel Ortega stood, his usually quiet voice carrying authority. "My family's been on this land since before it was called Wyoming Territory. We've watched American law be used to steal from us, to justify taking what others want. But sometimes that same law can be a shield instead of a sword. If we present our case right, if we make enough noise that territorial officials can't ignore us, maybe we force them to choose principle over profit." "It's a gamble," Thomas Bridger said, his wounded shoulder bandaged but his spirits apparently undiminished. "Judge could be completely in Continental's pocket, could rule against us regardless of evidence. Then we lose." Ethan found himself speaking, surprised by his own certainty. "But we lose honestly, in the light, with everyone watching. That's better than being picked off in the dark. And maybe losing the right way starts something bigger, shows other people they can fight too." The group talked deep into the night, refining strategy, preparing testimony, building a case that would either save the cooperative or at least expose Continental's methods for everyone to see. As the discussions continued, Ethan slipped away with Evelyn, needing a moment of quiet away from the crowd. They walked to the creek where the springs fed cool water into the valley, the same springs his father had died defending. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky in profligate abundance, and the sound of running water provided a counterpoint to the distant voices from the homestead. "Your father would have loved this," Evelyn said softly. "All these people coming together, standing for something that matters. He would have loved you." Ethan took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You're everything he believed in: determination, hope, refusal to quit even when the odds are impossible." "I'm terrified." The admission seemed to cost her something. "What if we lose? What if the hearing goes against us and Continental takes everything? What if all these people stood with us for nothing?" "Then we lose knowing we fought as hard as we could, that we didn't surrender, didn't let fear dictate our choices." Ethan turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands. 3 months ago, I was just drifting, no purpose, no hope, convinced that attachment only led to loss. You changed that. You showed me that some things are worth the risk of loss, that standing and fighting beats running and surviving. Even if fighting costs us everything, especially then. He kissed her gently, tasting salt and smoke. "I love you, Evelyn Moore. Whatever happens in 3 days, whatever the judge decides, that doesn't change. We built something here, not just your research or the cooperative, but us, that survives regardless of who owns the land title." They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other, and gradually made their way back to the homestead where the coalition was still planning, still hoping, still refusing to accept that corporate power was the final word on who got to dream. The 3 days before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. The coalition members returned to their own ranches, not wanting to give Continental targets to strike before the legal confrontation. Ethan and Evelyn remained at the homestead with a rotating guard, making final preparations for the case that would determine everything. On the morning of the hearing, they rode to Cheyenne with an escort of 20 armed settlers, not looking for violence but making it clear they wouldn't be easy victims if Continental tried anything desperate. The territorial courthouse was a substantial brick building, built to project authority in a landscape that recognized only power. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the hearing, and people filled every available seat: ranchers, miners, businessmen, journalists from 3 different newspapers. Even the territorial governor was present, his face carefully neutral, but his presence suggesting this case had become too visible to ignore. Continental Cattle Company's legal team occupied one table, 4 lawyers in expensive suits radiating confidence and competence. Richard Ashford sat with them, his expression coldly professional. At the other table, Evelyn and Ethan sat with a single attorney they'd managed to hire, an aging lawyer named William Cross, who'd agreed to take their case because he'd watched Continental operate for years and thought someone should finally challenge them. The judge was Henry Morrison, a man in his 60s with a reputation for strictness and an uncertain relationship with corruption. He could go either way, Ethan knew. The entire case balanced on whether Morrison valued law more than the money Continental almost certainly offered him. "This hearing," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying through the crowded courtroom, "concerns ownership of a homestead property in the Northern Territory currently held by Miss Evelyn Moore. Continental Cattle Company disputes her title, claiming the original land seizure was invalid. We're here to determine the facts and render judgment." He looked at Continental's late attorney. "Present your case." What followed was 2 hours of legal argument that made Ethan's head spin. Continental's lawyers presented documents, cited precedents, argued with polished efficiency that Jacob Hale's debts had been improperly handled and the territorial sale to Evelyn therefore invalid. Their case was technically sound, professionally presented, and probably rehearsed for days. But when William Cross stood to present their defense, he did something Continental hadn't anticipated. Instead of arguing technical legal points, he called witnesses. Thomas Bridger testified first, his wounded arm in a sling, describing years of Continental pressure. Margaret Chen followed, detailing how her late husband had been driven to an early grave by stress from corporate intimidation. Samuel Ortega spoke about his family's history and the pattern of land theft disguised as legal proceedings. One by one, the coalition members told their stories, painting a picture of systematic corporate abuse that went far beyond a single disputed homestead. Then Evelyn took the stand, and the courtroom went completely silent. "I'm an agricultural researcher," she began, her voice steady despite the dozens of eyes fixed on her. My father spent 20 years developing methods to make frontier farming sustainable and independent. He died believing corporations wanted to suppress his work because it threatened their control of settlers. I came to Wyoming to prove him right or wrong. She gestured to the documents Cross had entered as evidence. What I found was systematic effort by Continental Cattle Company to control water rights, manipulate land sales, and eliminate independent operators. They didn't just dispute my ownership. They burned my barn, killed my livestock, hired armed men to murder me, and everyone who stood with me. Continental's lead attorney shot to his feet. Objection! These are baseless accusations without evidence? Cross interrupted smoothly. I have testimony from 20 witnesses who fought off Continental's hired guns 3 nights ago. I have documentation of every suspicious land transfer in the past 3 years. I have proof that this case isn't about legal technicalities. It's about whether corporations can buy and steal their way to monopoly control. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from neutral to something harder, more engaged. Continue, Miss Moore. Your Honor, my father believed that knowledge should be shared, that settlers should have access to methods that help them survive without corporate dependence, that threatens Continental's business model. So they've tried to drive me out through intimidation, destroy my research through arson, and now steal my land through legal manipulation. Evelyn's voice strengthened. But they miscalculated. They thought I was alone. They didn't expect an entire territory full of people tired of being pushed around. The hearing stretched into the afternoon as Cross systematically dismantled Continental's claims while building a counter-narrative about corporate corruption. The journalists in attendance scribbled furiously, recognizing a story that would resonate far beyond Wyoming territory. This wasn't just about one homestead. It was about whether frontier law would serve justice or money. Finally, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Continental's lawyers maintained their technical case with icy professionalism. Cross responded with passion that seemed to fill the courtroom, painting a choice between law as shield for the powerless versus law as weapon for the powerful. Your Honor, Cross concluded, this case will define what Wyoming territory becomes. If you rule for Continental, you tell every settler that property rights exist only until corporations want what they own. If you rule for Miss Moore, you affirm that law protects everyone equally, regardless of wealth or influence. The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Judge Morrison was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he spoke words that would echo through the territory for years to come. I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. Continental Cattle Company's technical arguments have merit. There are legitimate questions about the original land seizure process. However, he paused, his eyes moving across the packed courtroom. I cannot ignore the broader context presented by the defense. The pattern of behavior, the documented intimidation, the systematic effort to control resources through means that, while technically legal, often violate the spirit of frontier law. Ethan's heart was hammering so hard he could barely hear the judge's next words. Furthermore, I find Miss Moore's purchase of the property was conducted in good faith through proper territorial channels. Whatever irregularities occurred in the original seizure, she cannot be held responsible for them. Therefore, I rule that Miss Moore's title to the disputed property is valid and will remain unchallenged. Morrison's gaze fixed on Continental's table. Additionally, I'm ordering a territorial investigation into Continental Cattle Company's land acquisition practices over the past 5 years. If evidence of illegal activity is found, appropriate charges will be filed. The courtroom erupted. Cheers from the settlers, angry protests from Continental's representatives, journalists rushing for the doors to file their stories. Ethan pulled Evelyn into his arms, feeling her shake with relief and triumph and exhaustion. They'd won. Against impossible odds, against corporate power, against a system designed to favor wealth over justice, they'd won. But Continental wasn't finished. As they left the courthouse, Richard Ashford intercepted them on the steps, his face a mask of cold fury. Enjoy your victory, Miss Moore. It won't last. Continental has resources you can't imagine. We'll tie you up in appeals for years, make your life so expensive and complicated that you'll eventually wish you'd taken our original offer. Maybe. Evelyn met his anger with calm certainty. But every day I hold that land is another day settlers see that corporations aren't invincible. Every appeal you file is another newspaper story about your methods. You can fight me, Mr. Ashford, but you can't fight what I represent. The idea that honest people have a right to build futures without corporate permission. Ashford's jaw tightened, but he had no response. Because she was right, and they both knew it. The hearing had exposed Continental's practices to public scrutiny. The territorial investigation would uncover things they'd rather keep hidden. The newspaper stories spreading across the country would make their investors nervous and their board of directors angry. They'd won the battle. What happened next would determine if they won the war. Over the following weeks, change rippled through Wyoming territory like wind through grass. The territorial investigation uncovered exactly what Cross had suggested, a pattern of land manipulation, bribery, and intimidation that went back years. 3 Continental executives were indicted. Water rights were reviewed, and in several cases redistributed. Independent ranchers who'd been driven out found legal recourse to reclaim their properties. It wasn't perfect justice. Some corporate officials escaped prosecution through legal maneuvering. Some settlers had been gone too long to return. But it was something. It was a crack in the facade of corporate invincibility, proof that people pushing back could create change. The agricultural cooperative Evelyn had proposed grew beyond anything she'd initially imagined. 47 families joined within the first 3 months, pooling resources and knowledge to implement her father's research on a scale that benefited everyone. The irrigation method she'd planned worked exactly as promised, allowing crops to thrive where they'd previously failed. The sustainable farming practices proved profitable, giving settlers economic independence they'd never achieved under corporate control. And through it all, the homestead itself transformed. The barn was rebuilt, bigger and better than before. The house was expanded to include proper research facilities where Evelyn could continue developing agricultural techniques. The fields that had once been monuments to his father's failure became demonstrations of what was possible when determination met methodology. 1 year after the hearing, Ethan stood on the porch where his father had died and looked out across a valley transformed by purpose and persistence. The cooperative's success had drawn more settlers, families willing to risk frontier life because Evelyn's research gave them realistic hope of survival. Small structures dotted the landscape, new homesteads built on foundation of knowledge instead of desperate faith. Evelyn emerged from the house, her hands stained with soil from the experimental gardens she maintained, her face bright with satisfaction that never quite faded these days. She was pregnant, 4 months along, carrying the future they'd built together. Margaret Chen stopped by earlier, she said, settling beside him on the porch swing his father had built. Says the wheat yield on her property is up 40% using the irrigation schedule we developed. The Morrison brothers want to try the crop rotation method next season. Samuel's talking about starting a seed exchange so everyone can access the best varieties. Your father's work. Ethan slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, finally reaching the people who need it. Our work now, yours and mine and everyone who stood with us. She rested her head against his shoulder, her hand moving to the gentle swell of her belly. Your father would be proud. My father, too. They believed impossible things could happen if people were brave enough to try. They were right. Ethan had spent a year coming to terms with that truth. His father's death hadn't been foolish or wasteful. It had been the price of standing for something that mattered. And that stand, combined with Evelyn's determination and the coalition's courage, had created something lasting. They were right, and we proved it. The sun tracked westward, painting the valley in shades of gold that made even the hard-scrabble land beautiful. Cattle grazed in improved pastures. Gardens flourished where determination met knowledge. Children played in yards where families had planted roots instead of maintaining escape routes. Continental Cattle Company still existed, still wielded power in other territories. But in Wyoming, their dominance had been broken. The investigation had resulted in structural changes, better oversight of land transfers, protection for water rights, legal recourse for settlers facing corporate intimidation. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still existed. Powerful interests still tried to control resources. But now there was resistance, organized and effective, giving honest people fighting chances they'd never had before. As evening approached, coalition families began arriving for the monthly gathering that had become tradition. Thomas Bridger with his arm mostly healed. Margaret Chen with news about a widow looking to homestead nearby. The Morrison brothers, their debt to Continental paid off through successful harvests and freedom to farm their way. Samuel Ortega with 3 of his grown children, all planning to establish their own homesteads using cooperative methods. They gathered around fires as darkness fell, sharing food and stories and plans for the future. These people had faced violence together, had stood against forces that seemed invincible, had proved that courage and community could overcome corporate power. They'd created something precious in this harsh land, not just successful farms, but a network of mutual support that transformed individual struggles into collective strength. Carl Hendricks raised a cup in toast, his weathered face split by a grin. To the cooperative, to Evelyn Moore and her impossible dreams, to standing our ground and proving that the land belongs to those brave enough to work it. The toast was echoed by 40 voices, people who'd once been strangers, united by common cause and uncommon courage. They drank to survival, to prosperity, to the future they were building one stubborn season at a time. Later, after the guests had departed and stars filled the sky with ancient light, Ethan and Evelyn stood together looking at the homestead they'd defended and transformed. The buildings were solid now, improved through cooperative labor and shared resources. The fields were planned for spring planting, using methods that balanced productivity with sustainability. The springs his father had died defending now irrigated multiple properties, their water shared through agreements that benefited everyone. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd actually been just passing through?" Evelyn asked quietly. "If you'd refused to guide me, if we'd taken Continental's offers and walked away." "We'd have survived," Ethan said honestly. "Found other places, other dreams. But we wouldn't have this." He gestured to the valley, to the life they'd built, to the future, taking root and ground once soaked with blood and failure. "We wouldn't have proved that standing your ground matters, that some things are worth fighting for regardless of cost. Your father knew that. My father died believing it. We lived proving it." Ethan turned to face her fully, his hands finding hers in the darkness. "You weren't just passing through, Evelyn. Neither was I. We were both looking for home without knowing it, looking for a place where our scars could become foundations instead of just wounds. And we found it," wonder colored her voice. "Against every odd, despite every threat, we found it. The wind carried the scent of growing things, of water, and turned earth and possibility. The same wind that had witnessed his father's death now carried the laughter of children playing on land they'd helped make livable. The same stars that had watched Ethan run from his past now illuminated the future he'd chosen to build. His father's dream hadn't died with him. Evelyn's father's research hadn't been lost. Those dreams had merged, transformed, become something larger than either man could have imagined. A cooperative that proved settlers could thrive independent of corporate control. That knowledge shared was more powerful than knowledge hoarded. That communities built on mutual support could withstand any pressure. "I used to think attachment was dangerous," Ethan said, voicing thoughts he'd carried for 6 years. That loving anything meant setting yourself up for loss. Spent years running from connections, from places, from the possibility of caring enough to be hurt. And now? Now I know that the opposite is true. Not attaching, not caring, not standing for anything. That's what's truly dangerous. That's how you lose yourself piece by piece until there's nothing left but motion, without meaning. He pulled her closer, one hand moving to rest gently on the swell of her belly, where their child grew. "You taught me that. Taught me that some things are worth the risk of loss, worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible." "We taught each other." Evelyn's hand covered his, their child moving beneath their joined palms. "I came here believing in research and methods and my father's theories. But you taught me that knowledge without courage is useless, that dreams require people willing to defend them when force tries to crush them." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd been lost until they'd found each other, who'd been running until they'd found ground worth standing on. The homestead behind them was more than structures and fields. It was proof that determination and love could transform even the harshest places into something worth calling home. In the distance, a coyote sang to the moon, and the springs continued their eternal flow, feeding crops and dreams with equal generosity. Wyoming territory stretched vast and challenging around them, but no longer felt impossible. They'd broken its worst power, the lie that only corporations and wealthy interests could succeed here, that honest settlers were doomed to fail. They'd proved that courage and community could carve futures from stone, that shared knowledge was stronger than hoarded power, that love planted deep enough could survive even frontier storms. Ethan Hale had stopped running, had finally put down roots in ground watered by his family's sacrifice and Evelyn's determination. Had learned that home wasn't just a place but a choice, the decision to stand and build instead of fleeing and surviving. Evelyn Moore had finished her father's work and created something beyond his imagination, not just research, but a living demonstration that his methods could transform lives and landscapes. She'd proved that Eastern women could not only survive the frontier, but reshape it, that intelligence and determination were the only credentials that mattered. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a cooperative that would continue growing, helping families establish themselves, proving year after year that sustainable prosperity was possible for those willing to work smart and stand together. The child growing inside Evelyn would be born into a different world than either of her parents had known. Not easier, the frontier would always be harsh, but more hopeful. A world where community mattered more than corporate control, where knowledge was shared freely, where people had real chances to build futures on their own terms. That was the legacy of two fathers who'd died believing in impossible things, and two children who'd lived proving those beliefs weren't impossible at all. Just difficult, just requiring more courage and determination and stubborn hope than most people possessed. But some people had that courage. Some people refused to quit despite every reason to surrender. And when those people found each other, found common cause and mutual support, they could transform landscapes and futures. Ethan pulled Evelyn closer, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with soil and sage, feeling her warmth against the cooling night. They'd survived the fire, survived the threats, survived the legal battles and corporate pressure and every attempt to break their will. More than survived, they'd thrived, had built something beautiful from ashes and blood and impossible dreams. The homestead stood solid behind them, lights glowing warm against the darkness. Inside those walls, research continued. Plans were made. Seeds were cataloged for spring planting. The work that had brought Evelyn across the country continued, amplified by cooperation and shared purpose. And out in the valley, on properties scattered across the territory, families slept secure in the knowledge that they had allies. That if Continental or any other corporate interest tried the same tactics again, a coalition stood ready to resist. That they weren't alone in their struggles, but part of something larger, a network of mutual support that made individual homesteads pieces of a stronger whole. This was what victory looked like. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and lasting and worth every sacrifice that had purchased it. Ethan had thought returning to his family's homestead would destroy him. Instead, it had made him whole, had given him purpose and love and a future he'd stopped believing possible. The land his father died defending had become ground where dreams took root and flourished, where blood spilled in violence had nourished hope instead of feeding despair. "Come inside," Evelyn said softly, tugging his hand. "It's cold, and our child needs rest even if we don't." Ethan let himself be led toward the house his father built and he'd repaired, toward the warmth and light and future waiting inside. He paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the valley spreading into darkness, at the land that had taken everything and given back more than he'd imagined possible. His father's grave was out there somewhere, unmarked but not forgotten. And standing on this porch, defending this land through law and courage instead of just violence, Ethan finally felt like he'd honored that sacrifice, had proved that Jacob Hale's stubborn belief in impossible things hadn't been foolish but visionary. "I'm home," Ethan said quietly, the words both statement and revelation. "Finally, after 6 years of running, I'm home." "We both are," Evelyn agreed, her hand warm in his. "We both are." They crossed the threshold together, closing the door against the Wyoming night, secure in the knowledge that they'd found what both had been seeking. Not just land or research success or vindication of their father's dreams, but something more fundamental, a place to stand, a reason to fight, a love worth defending against any threat. She'd never been just passing through, neither had he. They'd been traveling toward this moment, this place, this future they would build together on ground that no longer whispered only of failure but sang of possibility. The homestead settled into peaceful darkness, solid and secure. No longer a grave but a garden where impossible things took root and flourished, where two wandering souls had found home, where the frontier's harsh truth that survival required more than determination alone had been transformed by knowledge and courage into something beautiful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work of building sustainable futures was never finished, but tonight they rested secure in what they'd accomplished, in the love they'd forged through fire, in the community they'd helped create. Roots, not roads, standing ground instead of running away. That was the lesson written in every repaired board and planted seed and child conceived in hope instead of fear. Ethan Hale had finally stopped moving, had found his reason to stay, and in staying, had discovered that the life worth living was the one you built with your own hands on ground, you defended with your whole heart. The wind sang on, carrying stories across the vast Wyoming landscape, stories of courage and community, of dreams defended and futures earned, of two people who'd looked at failure and seen foundation, who'd stood their ground when every instinct screamed to run. Their story would echo through the territory for generations, becoming the legend that inspired others to try, to stand, to believe that impossible things were just difficult things waiting for people brave enough to attempt them. And in the house where it all began, where tragedy had given way to triumph, Ethan and Evelyn slept, their hands clasped even in dreams, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. Together. Home at last.